morning, everyone. On behalf of the ISO, we'd like to welcome you to today's Resource Adequacy Modeling and Program Design Track 2 RAME and Outage Substitution Stakeholder Meeting to discuss the straw proposal. Just a reminder that all meeting materials, including the straw proposal, can be found on the RAMPD initiative webpage. My name is Christina Guimera, representing ISO Stakeholder Affairs, and I will be facilitating today's meeting. I am joined here in the room by Ansel Lundberg and Partha Malvadkar, and we also have Sergio Duenas Melendez online. Just a few reminders here before we get started. Today's call is being recorded for informational and convenience purposes only, and any related transcription should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. This meeting is intended to stimulate open dialogue and engage different perspectives, so please keep your comments professional and respectful today. And also, please try to keep your comments and questions succinct so that we're able to hear from everyone. Today, you can access closed captioning on the bottom left hand of your screen, as well as Inteller Transparency Viewer on the bottom right hand of your screen. Just be sure to refresh that prior to viewing. We welcome and look forward to your engagement and participation today. For raising your hand during the meeting, the raise hand icon is directly at the bottom of your WebEx screen. If you joined audio only, please press *3 on your device. And please remember to state your name and affiliation first before making a comment. And also be mindful to pause a few seconds before speaking after you're unmuted. Sometimes there's a WebEx delay and it can cut off your introduction. And you can also send comments and questions via chat to all panelists. And if you need any technical assistance during the meeting, please send a chat to the event producer in Inteller Events. Today, Partha will get us started with an introduction. Then Ansel will take us through RAME reform proposal. Then Ansel will discuss next steps on bidding requirements. And then he'll discuss next steps for outage substitution. And then discuss proposal outage definitions before we wrap up for the day with next steps. So with that, I will turn things over to Partha Malvadkar to get us started.
We'll go one more slide too. Thanks everybody. I really appreciate everybody who's taken the time to join us here today. I see we already have one hand raised from Susan Schneider. We'll take your call momentarily, but that was sort of what I was going to kick it off with. I really appreciated the stakeholder engagement and participation on these complicated topics. At least we recognize there's a series of RA reform efforts. Some of them have been completed in terms of our Track 1 default rules and modeling changes, as well as our Track 3A related to resource visibility. We have future initiatives scoped, particularly on backstop reforms, and are considering as well what the pathway forward on topics that we had significant feedback when Flux RA looked like. But for today, we're really here to focus in on advancing reforms related to particularly our resource adequacy availability incentive mechanism, as well as our outage substitution processes. And we recognize that we had a lot of feedback, a lot of different perspectives, just in terms of what the goals and objectives should be for these proposals, what the different policy solutions look like. We've incorporated a lot of that feedback within our proposal, but we also recognize that there are probably some details that were not included or sort of will need to be filled as we move forward. So I think we're really looking forward to the continued engagement by folks as we look to advance these changes. But maybe with that, I'll pause to see if there's any questions before we get into the substance of the proposal.
Yeah, so first, could you take a, sure. First we'll go to Susan Schneider.
Hi, Susan Schneider, Phoenix Consulting, representing LSA. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. I had a question not about the substance of the discussion today, but about what is not in the substance of the discussion today. Just going through the straw proposal document. We have been trying to track all the, some of this stuff and fairly lightly because for the most part, it has not really involved variable resources, and RAME does not cover variable resources at this point. But it looks like there is a change. There is a proposed change to cover variable resources in the straw proposal. It's not in the slides today, and it doesn't look like it's on the agenda for discussion. But I wanted to raise a red flag just to remind everybody who might not have been around originally that the reason that the variable resources are exempted from RAME is because they, by and large, have PPAs that do not pay them unless they're operating and they're producing, and that is a bigger incentive than just about anything the CAISO could really do to them for not being there when they're supposed to be there. So the inclusion is very lightly touched on. It refers to day ahead obligations, which variable resources don't have must offer obligations in the day ahead. So, and it's just not well explained at all in the proposal. So I wanted to raise a red flag. I think we might have to jump in on that if you're going to pursue that. And just make sure that it doesn't sort of slip through the cracks and just get approved without really much discussion, which is kind of the way it's treated in the proposal.
No, thanks, Susan. That's where one particular element that we recognize the fact that we had a fairly high level description around what the objectives look like associated with it, and that, well, at least I'm not going to try to steal Ansel's thunder because we're going to get into some of this later as well. But I think that the highest levels we recognize the fact that this is a paradigm shift in terms of how RAME would work today and the definitions of available assessment hours versus how this revised proposal would be functioning, and that there might be an ability to create a more targeted incentive mechanism that applies to all resources, but also recognizes some of the limitations in their design. And so I think that's the balance that we're trying to strike as we move forward. But we recognize as well that there would be some sensitivities of, like, if this did not work for certain resource types, certain contract types, we're certainly wanting that feedback and engagement on sort of how can we correct some of the challenges that were identified in the stakeholder process, where we had fairly broad exemptions of resource types, resource classifications, but not have it still be workable. So I think that's what we're trying to towards.
The point was that there was a reason for that exemption in the first place. There's a reason UCAP is not really considered, at least depending on how you're looking at it, for variable resources, because they do have those very strong incentives to be available all the time. In particular, when market prices are high and indicating when the markets are stressed. But basically, assuming they're just even paid under their PPAs, they don't generate, they're not paid. So that has not changed. But through all the changes in the CAISO markets, that fundamental incentive is still there, and the PPA structure, being only variable, has not changed. And the whole time the CAISO has been operating. So we don't really see the reason for that change. And if you're going to propose to do it, I think we're going to have to register a big concern about that, particularly given the lack of discussion and explanation for why it would be needed. So I understand you could apply it. It could also always have been applied that way, but there was a reason that it wasn't. And we don't want that to be lost. And we'll probably have to, like I said, we'll probably have to jump in now and put in some comments on that, but very alarmed to see it come up without really any explanation as to why it would even be needed.
Thanks, Susan.
Thank you, Susan. Next, we have a hand raised from Nick Pappas. Go ahead, Nick.
Hey, Partha. Hey, Ansel. Hey, everybody. Hey, I don't want to go deeper into the discussion on this, but just to echo Susan's comments, I think there will be a lot more to discuss around the VER proposal. So just, I guess, to kind of clarify, when would you like to go into that discussion? Is that something that we'll have today, or just to kind of let us know? Because I think there is a lot to say about that and a lot of questions and comments that many of us might have on it.
Yeah, we have a slide later on it. So how about we have that a more robust? We're expecting to have that more robust discussion here today. So how about we wait till we get to that slide? It'll be not too much longer. But Thanks.
That's great. That sounds great. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm not seeing any other questions coming in at this time, so I think we can continue.
All right. Thank you, Partha. Thanks, Christina. So I'll take some time to take a high-level overview of the proposal section on RAME reform today. Go to the next slide. So we'll talk a little bit about the history of RAME as a tool at the ISO, review the problem statements from the working group and our objectives in the proposal, review some stakeholder feedback, and then talk through the proposal itself. So we can go to the next slide. Great. So just a little bit about RAME as it exists today. We've spent a good amount of time, as Partha mentioned, with stakeholders kind of reviewing RAME's current design in the working group process and floating different options for design changes and reforms to RAME over the last year or so. So in the paper, we include a little bit about RAME's origin, and it was designed to replace the expiring standard capacity product in order to incentivize resources that are RA capacity and have those obligations that are affiliated with that to be available when system reliability depends on them. And the goal of RAME was that, you know, these resources would be available during key hours that the system is most at risk, which have manifested as availability assessment hours, which occur kind of day in, day out on weekdays based on a CAISO study. And it was meant to simplify the process of kind of making sure these resources are available and providing a straightforward tool to do this job and affects or the effective at targeting those availability incentives. So we are not going to review the availability assessment hours as it exists today. That study is shared with stakeholders in the annual flex capacity needs assessment process. But again, those availability assessment hours occur during weekdays in 5 consecutive hours. And this proposal really is looking to move away from that kind of day in, day out approach as a complement to UCAP as an LRA QC methodology. So I think it is designed to encourage resource owners to plan and conduct maintenance and to make sure resources are available during these hours, and to encourage resources to return to service in a timely manner following forced outages, and also to procure replacement substitute capacity when those resources are on outages. So I think the stakeholders have identified some limitations in RAME's design, sort of by the design itself, but also by the limitations in the goals and objectives. So we review in the paper some of those objectives as they exist today, but then we also have our new problem statements for the working group about RAME, sort of, and the job that it's doing now and what stakeholders envision that the role that it could play in an RA program. So let's go to the next slide. So those problem statements are, you know, in light of RA prices and market incentives, RAME may be an ineffective incentive mechanism in order to ensure that capacity is actually bid into the market. RAME is applied to only a fraction of the RA fleet, RA capacity, and the current availability standard debt band provides insufficient incentive to be available, which is sort of combined with the monthly netting process that assesses resources availability across the month. This can result in incentivizing less reliable generation to be contracted and also discouraging FCs to show all of their RA resources to the ISO. And then, of course, also when the ISO doesn't incentivize capacity to be available, this can create capacity procurement mechanism and backstop procurement challenges for the ISO because substitute capacity isn't shown. And then additionally, the working group determined that we should assess RAME on this basis to understand if it's meeting its intended objectives and what new objectives it might need as an operational tool to complement QC methodology and market price incentives. So we've been exploring this assessment with the group, especially in the context of how local regulatory authorities' qualifying capacity methodologies are changing. And like Partha mentioned, the ISO just updated its own default qualifying capacity methodology. So the goal that we've had our eyes on is to reform RAME in a way that complements those changes to counting rules. I also wanted to mention, we included in the paper some data analysis on RAME and RA resource availability and performance. Some of that you'll recognize from the issue paper from a year and a half ago, but there are a few additional pieces of information in that section. So generally that analysis shows a higher outage rate for RA resources during September 2022. We zoomed in on that period, though that was several years ago. That was one of the last times the ISO grid experienced capacity shortfalls in a late summer heat wave during EEA conditions. So this evidence that we have in the data analysis section shows these concerns where the price and the timing of RAME as it exists today might not align well with our reliability needs during these key hours that matter most. And, you know, we did see, I think, that resources that were not on forced outage during these critical conditions did have bidding behavior that met. However, I think those forced outage rates for thermal and storage resources in September 2022 were higher than the shown RA values. I think this is to be expected to some extent since QC methodology does not account for outage rates in these resources yet. But as we move forward with UCAP from some LRAs, including the CPUC, this is why we're taking a look at RAME in this context. So let's go to the next slide. So the objectives that we have in this proposal are, I've sort of alluded to this earlier, but counting rules, also known as qualifying capacity methodologies that are set by the LRAs, should work in tandem with operational tools like RAME and energy market price signals. And these tools combined add up to achieve these objectives. So reducing forced outage rates from all resource types, particularly during stress grid conditions, aligning shown RA values with expected ability of those resources to offer and be available and to perform, and also to encourage resources to offer into our markets day in and day out, which is in accordance with their must offer obligations as RA capacity, but particularly during those key system stress hours. So that is the objectives. I have up here the forced outage rates for RA resources during, planned and forced outage rates during that first 2 weeks of September period, which are higher than the assumed forced outage rates that the ISO uses in its summer assessment processes, even after updating those more recently in the last few years to be more contemporary. So all of this is adding up to how we've developed this RAME reform proposal while also being informed by stakeholder feedback. All right, let's go to the next slide.
We do have a couple of hands raised at the moment, so we'll pause for questions.
Yeah.
First, we'll go to Susan Schneider.
Hi, Susan Schneider, Phoenix Consulting. I'm wondering if any of your forced outage analyses through this process, starting on when you must have mentioned that first on slide 10, any of that, you talked about storage and thermal resources. Did any of your forced outage analyses include variable resources?
So this analysis, this graph showing the forced outage rates is for all RA capacity. So that includes all resources that are shown as RA. This is generally the case for the data analysis that we have in the paper. It's focused on all RA resources. So that would include any resource types. There is also there's one figure in the paper that is including all resource types. It's the first one in the data analysis section. So that one is not just for RA resources. That's all resource types.
Right. But
I'm sorry, non-RA and RA.
Okay, my point is that if you are looking to expand the applicability to resource types that are not included in RAIM at this point, it would be helpful to have an analysis of those additional resource types on a separate basis. I think you would find that those resource types probably have low forced outage rates during the peak periods. But I guess we'll put that in our comments. But the expansion to additional resource types might does suggest that you really should look at those separately to see if there's really an issue there.
We'll make a note of that. Yeah.
Okay,
Just add the
thanks.
data in the paper. I think we broke it down by we had thermal imports, energy storage, and I think maybe hydro as sort of additional categories within the paper.
Right.
I think you're making a fair observation. We could break it down further to sort of bolster the claim. We can get into that a little bit, the details later about the exemptions and what's appropriate. But yeah, thanks for that feedback, Susan.
Okay, yeah, I mean, I think it's because of the proposed applicability expansion that you would potentially look at that. But all the categories you've explained or you described just now, I think, are already subject to RAIM, so it's a different issue here.
Thank you, Susan. Next in the queue, we have Kathleen Colbert. Go ahead, Kathleen.
Yeah, no, thanks. This is Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. I appreciate you stopping here because I had more just like clarifying questions around this rather than your proposal. I actually appreciate that you selected this particular window because it's so clear in my memory during that time from an operational perspective. I also have like all of my own internal reports like readily available to kind of look back at. And so I had a couple just like pieces of things I wanted to offer for you to consider and maybe think about a way to update how you're showing this data or this information. The first is I do recommend breaking it out between the maintenance and forced outages in the bar chart. So you do a stack bar chart. I think that will help us as a community just to better understand what you're describing. When you bundle it together, it's very difficult to see what's the portion of this total stack that's made up of both. And part of the reason I make that suggestion is that there's another operational tool that was being used during this time frame that is not mentioned on this slide, and that is very important and critical to the operations during this window. So like looking back at my reports, I know that I was reporting out every time the CAISO issued a restricted maintenance outage, restricted maintenance operations instruction. They were being sent on most days, like through the beginning of September. It is interesting and important that the way that tool is structured, it sends out an RMO for planned maintenance outages, but within hours, not necessarily across the day. So the other thing about the data that I honestly would be very helpful, because we know when the restricted maintenance outage instructions were, but we know they were only within certain hours. As if you showed this on an hourly basis and then kind of overlaid the RMO hours with a little tag or some indicator on your chart, which were RMOs, I think it will help build out your story. So it really, truly is just suggestions. I think that would help the community a lot. That restricted maintenance is what I think of as the primary tool for operations to ensure that even if there were previously approved maintenances, outages during an extreme condition like this, those are restricted. And so that's just a very important part of the story. Thanks.
Thank you, Kathleen. Next in the queue, we have Perry Servedio. Go ahead, Perry.
Hey, this is Perry Servedio, California Energy Storage Alliance. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I did have one thought that that you should consider, at least with this time frame back in 2022. There were period of several days there with very high sustained prices, basically all afternoon. And I'd be interested in the portion of these outages, at least related to the energy storage, that was due to nonlinearity in the energy storage at the end of their state of charge. What can occur, especially if you have sustained high prices all afternoon, is you can have energy storage resources that the CAISO calls on and dispatches maybe earlier in the afternoon. And I think there were also reports that they were doing this sort of that this was an error in the way that the CAISO was dispatching them at the time. But you can imagine that if you dispatch them early, they can run through 4 hours of discharge, essentially at their Pmax, and be trying to give extra energy from within their nonlinearity region or their foldback region at the times in which later in the day, but we need to put the forced outage on the resource in order to even offer that energy in, so that we're giving CAISO important operational data so that they can use that energy. So I guess the high level question is if there's a way to tease that out of this data, because it's extra energy that goes above and beyond their RA obligation.
Maybe can I ask back, Perry? And this is how I was thinking about it, so you can tell me if I'm wrong. So this is obviously from September 2022. And so there's a very different, like the amount of storage was very different, and like how the storage was being used is very different. So my own take would be there's probably a fairly large question mark just in terms of some of the storage data on how would it perform today and how what would availability look like today versus 2022. So like that's maybe a question I'd have. But I think that like the takeaway here, and it might be not, there's probably two sort of moving parts. One is that, like we kind of view availability as, being an issue, like, and it's not like, and we obviously have rain during these time periods that were being applied. And so I think some of the question mark is some of like, obviously there's sort of two pieces of like, we recognize with UCAP coming in, we kind of have a variety of different options. One is to, potentially, take on the type of proposal we had, but then there's a variety of other options in terms of saying, oh, we could modify it to, eliminate RAM entirely or keep RAM as it is. And so I think that like, I'm not sure that even answering these more detailed questions about this analysis will really help sort out like what that next step should look like in terms of like how we want to modify our program design, because there's just so many moving parts that we're trying to address simultaneously. But kind of the highest level would be kind of like, oh, availability is something that we need to pay attention to and address. But I don't know, any pushback, Perry, or any feedback?
No, I appreciate that. I mean, if that is the case, then I think all that I have left is to try not to leave stakeholders with a false impression of the performance of energy storage resources if in fact they were going above and beyond their RA obligations. I think that's all. But if you're just using this data to just they lightly inform the policy, then fine. And I recognize the storage fleet's very different today than it was 4 years ago. But perhaps a refresh would do, or at least a disclaimer that at least the disclaimer that you just gave would be nice to see whenever we're showing this type of information, especially if it's focused on the storage performance. Thanks, Partha.
Thanks, Barry. Next in the queue, we have Noah Tong. Go ahead, Noah.
Hey, this is Noah Tong from Middleware Power. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Great. Good morning. Just to join in on what Perry was saying, I think more details on the sort of the issues that we are seeing here on the specificity of various types of outages helps people figure out what the problem we're trying to actually solve. in a broad, on a sort of looking at this on a broad brush, I understand that availability is a problem, but looking at 2022 and in the straw proposal in 2024, 2022, and 2023, it certainly highlights issues of we have 8,000 megawatts or 5,000 megawatts of forced outages that have very little substitution for RA, but it doesn't show whether or not there's any capacity that was available for substitution. As we know, in 2022 and 2023, bilateral markets were very short, and so it's very difficult for everyone to get the substitute capacity. So all those things can really help provide context as to why certain things were happening, right? And to the extent that we are seeing outages, and we're in 2026 to still show 2022 and 2023 data without, has 24 and 25 situations improved. I think all that kind of currently lacks context. And we're trying to still figure out what is the problem we're trying to solve and whether or not the solutions that you have proposed are the right solutions, right? In the paper, you have also, you note that pricing for RAIN may be too low relative to market prices, but that seems that's sort of relevant to only a certain set of months because that's how the RA program is set up. Whereas, so in that sense, have you looked at shoulder months? What if shoulder months aren't in the paper? Is it because they don't matter, or there's a lot more substitution? There's a lot less forced outages. What we're not seeing any of that. I'll stop there for a second and see if you have any thoughts and feedback on that.
Yeah, thanks, Noah. I think I hear what you're saying. Kind of making some notes for the data, what kind of information you're looking for. Part of the focus on 2022 has been the direction of the RAIN reform has been focused on kind of critical hours for the system. And so being that was one of the greatest magnitude kind of scarcity events in recent years, it's been the focus of our attention on kind of how to reform this policy. And, I think shoulder months have their own dynamics. The last several discussions with stakeholders, we had focused on EEA and RMO conditions, which, can occur at any time. But the tendency is that the summer months are when we're seeing the most scarcity conditions and when we're really counting on RA resources to perform. But there's a lot of nuance there. So, and I hear what you're saying, Noah.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, you're setting policy for all months of the year. You're not setting. Certainly, we're all concerned about summer months for the time being, right? But if you're applying the same set of policies to all months, then we should be looking at the data for all months of the year. And the solution you've got here, sort of on, as you get into it, is to sort of increase the penalties more. I'm not sure whether or not, in order to say that to increase penalties more, you have to really define whether or not generators are taking forced outages because it's more economic. I don't think that's actually the case, right? If there's a tube leak, there's a tube leak. If that's not going to be solved or cured by more penalties.
Why don't we let's get to respond to your concerns. Let's go through the structure of the proposal for everyone else's sake, that we can debate sort of the merits of it versus sort of the problem statement. Yeah. I would say, at least maybe at the highest level here in terms of the data, I appreciate the feedback. We recognize, we had through the working group process, through the early phases of the initiative, like lots of requests for analysis. There was sort of multiple analysis requests. I recognize the fact that there's some different granularity that people want. I do think at the highest level that there's probably kind of like a number of moving parts they're having simultaneously, to where even if we showed the data showing like, hey, this is good performance under RAIN today, I think that there would be a number of questions around should we evolve it anyway, particularly given some of the regulatory changes that are happening outside of the market, then how should we change it? So I'm not positive that we wouldn't be having these same debates, even if the data showed very different outcomes. But maybe we can get into the policy proposal and then try to go circle back to the problem statements and see how they align or don't align. But
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you, Noah. Next in the queue, we have Mohan Nirula. Go ahead, Mohan.
Yeah, this is Mohan Nirula with CDWR. So I had a similar question here on this bar chart. If this is including maintenance and post outages, but also the provisions for the planned outage and post outage substitution, if those were done to some extent, the bar chart probably, if we net those substitutions, then the real impact would be to lower those outages for reliability, and the top of the bar would be reduced to some level, right? So it would be good to include forced outage substitution and planned outage substitution during that time and see how the impacts would be lowered for the reliability. So that's my thought. So if that bar chart is not including the substitutions that took place.
Thanks, Mohan.
Thank you.
Thank
Looks like we have one more question, follow-up hand from Kathleen Colbert. Go ahead, Kathleen.
No, thank you. And I'll be brief. Kathleen from Vistra. I did just want to, I understand where you're coming from, Partha, that you'd like to have a higher level kind of policy discussion. It sounds like rather than focus on the data. So I just wanted to maybe clarify that the reason that I was asking for the data clarifications is because it's a soft way of making this comment, which is my understanding is 100% planned outage substitution obligations was adopted in 2021. So we're looking at 2022 data, which means to me that data combining maintenance and forced outages, I'm going to assume, because you did not provide the level of detail necessary to see if there were any exceptions to that 100% POSO rule, I'm going to assume that all of the maintenance outages within that stack actually provided substitution, which means to me that it's bumping up that chart in a way that does not actually have anything to do with the problem statement at play today. So it looks higher, where in practice we would assume, knowing POSO's in effect, that those all had substitution. So the reason I brought up the restricted maintenance operation is because if there was an exception given to a maintenance outage that did not have substitution, the second tier protection for the grid in that event is that grid operation can issue restricted maintenance operations and have those hours. So if you were to show me the hours and I would still see maintenance without sub, which again is a level of detail not provided here, but maintenance without sub that still existed during RMO, I would actually say we have a different problem. Can we talk about that? And so I do think it is getting at the high level policy issue. But because I assume these all have sub, I actually assume you need to remove them completely because they're just artificially making it look higher. And then the second piece is that RAIN is not being assessed on maintenance outages. So that's another thing that makes us very misleading and confusing to stakeholders. So just helping you drive to that high level policy that you wanted to talk about. Because it's distracting when the data incorporates information that's irrelevant to the topic at play. The other thing I want to note is this, I actually like this time period as opposed to some of the other comments because I remember it so vividly. And I will share with you anecdotally that the thing that motivated behavior from a supply, motivated behavior during this time period honestly did not have much to do with rain. I'd say the two things that motivated behavior from a more of a forced outage perspective. So we did have a forced outage. We did come back as quickly as possible. The thing that motivated behavior were two things. One, good utility practice, and two, scarcity pricing. Thanks.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Kathleen.
Kathleen.
And I'm not seeing any other questions coming in at this time, so we can continue on.
Great. All right, so I'll just take a moment to review stakeholder feedback that we've received on the options that we've been considering with stakeholders the past several meetings regarding RAME reform. So I think generally there was a request to ensure coordination of RAME reform with UCAP and to time the changes of to RAME until we can evaluate if gaps remain after UCAP accreditation is implemented, and also to minimize sort of enforcing a penalty at the same period with RAME that UCAP may be as well. So that was heard from many stakeholders. We did discuss the RSC surcharge cost allocation for EDAM approach at the last stakeholder workshop, where we took a moment to review that as an option for an alternative for RAME pricing. And we got feedback, helpful feedback that would require more development. There were concerns that were raised about sort of fair cost causation and the unpredictability that this would create for generators about the magnitude of the charge. We also heard, related to RAME, but not directly relevant, and we'll talk to this more, that some stakeholders felt that the must-offer obligation should be tied to sort of a % of installed capacity, but not use PMAX specifically, to avoid requiring uncompensated offers beyond contracted capacity, but also recognizing the sort of statistical nature of UCAP QC accreditation. We also heard from several stakeholders, load-serving entities and generators, that directionally RAME penalties should apply more so during critical grid conditions at levels that are appropriate or calibrated, but not set too high, and look at other markets for kind of how to determine that. We also heard several stakeholders, we had entertained the idea of a performance incentive in addition to an availability incentive. So looking at real-time dispatch to meter in addition to outages and bids. So we hear that. And then finally on exemptions, to the earlier comments, we did receive a number of comments on, which resource types should be exempt or should not be exempt. So CDWR indicated participating load should be exempt, should continue to be exempt from RAME. American Clean Power indicated wind and solar should remain exempt as well. We heard that known storage operating limitations should be recognized in RAME assessments. Department of Market Monitoring wrote that smaller than 1 megawatt resources should not be exempt. And we had a few others from NCPA to retain the load following MSS exemption, and also to retain the ambient not due to temperature outage nature of work exemption for conditionally available resources from WAPA. So we've got a lot of good feedback on exemptions so far that's been helpful. And then we also heard from Calpine and Vistra that the inclination to reduce exemptions is wise as we narrow the assessment hours and really focus on critical periods instead of having those day in, day out AAH. All right, go to the proposal. So we've included this table, which is in the proposal, to kind of compare how RAME works today and look at where the proposal is the same and where it differs. So on the availability assessment, the intention is to keep the status quo of generally looking at a resource's shown RA or RA capacity to its must offer obligation and its offers for energy and its outage status. For the assessment period, again, we had discussed the TISO EDAM RSE failure as a condition. We discussed energy emergency alerts and restricted maintenance operations. We had settled on a differing approach that looks ahead instead of looking back as the AAH study does with a number of different inputs, but that remains fixed each year and is really looking at nearly over 15% of annual hours. This new assessment is focused on critical hours. And then the pricing, we have a different approach that matches this assessment period. On the assessment frequency, so instead of having availability sort of added up for each resource across each month, where if they're meeting a certain bandwidth of availability, they're not subject to charges or payments. Instead, we propose to look at kind of each tier RAME event and look at resources offers in each interval on that event basis. We've spoken a little bit to exemptions. There are a number of significant exemptions to the RA fleet for RAME exposure. And I think as we dial in these hours of assessment, which, that also means there depending on how we calibrate the assessment, there may be no RAME hours in a given year, depending on how conditions look. Whereas today, again, it's 5 hours each weekday. And so in the spirit of this, we want to allow reasonable management of RAME exposure to resources, whether that's through exemptions for natures of work as we have today, or other tools. But generally the goal being compare our resources shown RA capacity based on these new QC methodologies to their offers and calibrate accordingly. And then finally, on the charges, we have, again, keeping the status quo as far as any charges collected from resources that aren't available to these criteria get allocated back to resources that are available. And then an additional incremental load depending on how much is collected. So we have slides for each of these elements of the proposal. So we could stop and take a brief moment for questions.
I would suggest going through the slides.
Okay.
Going through the slides.
I think that'd be helpful.
All these pieces are integrated together, so
Yeah.
I imagine it'll be good to sort of go through them.
Great. So let's go to the next slide. And please make a note of your questions so we can regroup after the last explanation slide. So on this point, we've talked about this slide a bit already, but I'll hand it to Partha to kind of just recap that discussion and add a little bit more information.
Sure. And yeah, I appreciate the fact that we kind of had this discussion already at a high level. I think that maybe to reiterate, one of the problem statements that was identified as a part of the working group was that the number of exemptions that were provided to RAME made the program less effective. And I think that what we recognize is that there's been, 10 plus years of history in terms of how different exemptions and different categories were created. And some of them seem like they had, like in each one of the times that an exemption was created, there was obviously was a legitimate reason for that exemption to occur. And so I think that what we're looking at here is that particularly as we are moving away from the availability assessment hours construct with a focus really on critical periods that are identified, there's kind of a question of like, do we really need to have the same set of exemptions, or is there a way to have a more calculated availability that measures resources availability versus their, like how I think about it, is their must offer obligation, which might look different for different resource types. And so I think that that's the conversation we're looking to have, is like, how do we move away from that structure? And like, maybe to respond to some of the feedback we've had, we do view this as like for resources that perform well, there will be an opportunity to capture some of the upside. So we view this as part of the incentive structure. What we're doing here is, yes, they'll be providing a penalty to non-performing resources, but the fact that that the resources and megawatts that do perform would have extra compensation that actually sort of fuels the additional incentive that this provides. I do think that we can have a good debate about like which resource and which resource type may respond. And I see Susan, I see you with your hand raised. We'll get to your feedback on hers. I do think that there's a kind of a question in our mind of like how could this be structured well to work for different resource types and different contract types. We recognize that there's a lot of resources who can make similar claims to say like UCAP and a UCAP structure might also create strong incentives to be available during all hours. But particularly during these critical hours, I think our question is like, is there a way to have, even a stronger incentive mechanism that's applying to all resource types to be available? And we'll get to it later, maybe eventually have a performance tie-in as well that could be tied in to these resource types, but to not have it be burdensome, so it doesn't work for resources like variable energy resources whose use limitations are really sort of captured in the accreditation methods that the LRAs use. So that was really our basis of the design. But we'll get through the next couple of slides and maybe we can circle back on these various elements to discuss more.
Great. All right, so we'll go through slide 20 here. So thank you, Partha, for speaking to the kind of assessment and exemptions. Let's talk now about the proposal to replace availability assessment hours with this two-tiered assessment approach. So I think what we heard in stakeholder comments was, again, directionally, narrowing the hours of assessment makes sense as a complement to UCAP to reduce those kind of overlapping penalties between UCAP and RAME. But at the same time, there's still this need for this operational tool. And we have discussed EEA and RMO again. I think with this proposal, where Tier 1 aims to give units an incentive to be available in all hours as they are obligated to be as an RA capacity, but also when the penalty is triggered to provide some lead time on the order of a week or less to give an incentive to return from outage quickly enough to be operational during these periods. And that still functions as a tool to encourage forward procurement and replacement of resources on outage. And to get that incentive announced before the scarcity becomes binding in the market processes. And then the second tier of when RAME would be assessed and how would be when capacity becomes insufficient and when the CAISO balancing area fails the EDAM RSE in the day ahead. And so this would give a stronger incentive to make sure that RA resources are available into real time, but also into day ahead, and additional level of incentive to avoid outages that are unreplaced during stress conditions. So let's go to the next slide. So with Tier 1, again, the idea is to identify the risk periods of resource inadequacy before the scarcity occurs. So this would be done through an operational assessment that occurs daily on a rolling basis, looking ahead, up to 8 days out. And once this tier is triggered on a given day, it cannot be untriggered or reversed, with the intention there being the ISO wants to give a heads up for resources to become available if they're able, and to make sure that RA resources are meeting their obligations, so that if scarcity does not come to be based on forecast changes or outage changes, the incentive remains for those resources to be available. And so we purposely did not detail the assessment and how it would work in the paper. I think we're open to feedback on how this could be calibrated and computed, but we're envisioning an assessment that includes a look at current forced and urgent outage levels. It also looks at load forecast in the operational time frame versus shown RA, and perhaps also a buffer that represents kind of these various uncertainties in the operational forecast, including renewable production, outage changes, because a lot can change within 7 days or less even, and also, of course, load forecast changes. So the idea being that if these tests are failed, whatever the threshold is, that the assessment would be triggered, and then the penalty for this assessment would compare the resources must offer obligation against its bid and outage status like it does today for RAME, and the price would be linked to day ahead prices for the trade date when tier 1 is triggered. So let's go to the next slide. So just an example of how this assessment would work in the operational time frame. So imagine a couple weeks ago, it's April 27th. The assessment is run, looking at D-2 all the way out to D-8, 8 days ahead. And so in this instance, April 29th, the assessment is failed and RAME is triggered for that day. And that is announced through some kind of operational or market notice. And then it's also failed for Sunday, the 3rd. And then you'll also see the light blue box indicating on an assessment that was run 2 days prior, May 1st had failed. And so that declaration continues to be persistent as the day approaches. So I hope this gives a good sense of how we're envisioning this tool to work. Go to the next slide to talk about tier 2. So the second tier is more straightforward. During conditions when the ISO BA fails the RSC for EDAM, the penalty would be assessed, and again, resources must offer obligations would be compared to their bids for that day and the day ahead and real time, depending on their obligations. And then this penalty price, instead of moving forward with the RSE failure surcharge allocation as how to price the penalty, we propose this fixed value at $2,000 a megawatt hour to provide more certainty in the magnitude of the charge, and based also on what other ISOs use for their kind of similar tools. So let's go to the next slide. This I reviewed in the table on slide 14 or on 13, but generally we're looking to maintain the self-funding element of RAME as it exists today. There will be some modifications needed since we're going from the monthly accounting process and availability, and instead moving to this per event basis assessment. And then we would allocate the collected charges from resources that did not meet obligations back to resources that did meet their requirements, and also any remaining charges would go back to load. So before we take a moment to discuss, let's go to slide 20. There were a few considerations that we noted in the paper just to reflect on what we heard from stakeholders. The first being kind of FlexRA implications. I think this proposal and our discussions in track 2 so far have focused on system RA, but recognizing that today RAME applies to both system and FlexRA resources. So I'm going to hand it just briefly to Partha to discuss this more.
Yeah, and all three of these topics I think are, evolving based on stakeholder feedback and our own analysis. So at least for me to talk about FlexRA more at a high level, we recognize that we've had, a part of our working group structure had a second phase where we're going to be looking at second phase, really a fourth track that would include FlexRA as a potential reform item. But we also recognize, even in creating that structure, that there are lots of intertwined issues associated with how the RA design would function with how the RA for system resources would function with how RA for Flex would function. So I think there's like a valid questions and concerns around, well, if you're going to, keep or make, significant modifications to FlexRA, how will those designs function? And would you, for example, keep your current FlexRA requirements and RAME assessment, but like have this as a separate one. And so I think what we're really recognizing, and this is how it's set up within the tracks, is that we need to sort of take that on as a part of the FlexRA structure in terms of, from the biggest pillars of, like, I think, answer the questions of, do we need to keep FlexRA? If we're going to keep it, what are the modifications to be needed? As well as how should the performance assessment for FlexRA need to evolve to go along with it? So I think that's the piece on FlexRA. Do you want me to talk about performance assessment as well, Ansel, or?
Sure.
Okay. So this is another piece, and I think that I particularly would appreciate the DMM's feedback and their comments on this, as well as other participants. We had a set of feedback that was included in the paper or on the write-up, where I was just discussing how, obviously, the RAIN today and our proposal is really a day-ahead look at availability and bids in order to perform the assessment. And there's kind of a question around, well, what about particularly for resources that might indicate that they are available, but then ultimately in real time, they either don't bid in real time or they aren't able to perform in real time? Do you need to have a structure that addresses those concerns as well? And I think our approach there is, like, at least again, kind of maybe a sequential one, where I think we recognize the fact that, yes, this is probably something that needs to be dug into more. We think that for each one of these, it's a much higher, a much more complicated exercise to look at, particularly resource performance in real time. And if you're going to have some sort of penalty structure for non-performance beyond the energy charges that would occur today, that would need to be, there'd be a much more complicated endeavor. So I think what we're saying is that should be really a part of sort of a future phase to this. It could be a part of this initiative phase, or it could be a part of sort of a subsequent track. And we're looking for stakeholder feedback in terms of, like, we had a number of questions just in terms of how should we be looking and considering on that performance going forward. So
yeah,
thanks for that.
I think I've spoken to kind of how we view RAME in the context of changing QC methodologies, particularly UCAP. I think I don't need to say too much more there, but generally, the proposal does aim to create stronger incentives for resources to take these actions that improve availability beyond just the QC-based incentives. So I think let's take some time to discuss. I think we had a break time for 10:15, but we can take a little more time if we need to and just push that back.
Yeah. All right. First in the queue, we have Susan Schneider. Go ahead, Susan.
Hi, Susan Schneider, Phoenix Consulting. I have actually questions on several slides. You went through quite a few of them. On slide 14, you made it when we were talking about that. You made a statement that there was a feeling that the number of exemptions made RAME less effective. If RAME isn't needed for certain resources, there's the sweeping statements here. I mean, I understand the opinions behind them, but sweeping statements on things like that, there is a reason for exemptions in the first place. I'm not going to go through all that again, don't worry. But the idea is that if you impose additional penalties potentially on resources that don't really, where it won't improve the performance, then basically that means the exemptions didn't make it less effective. So I don't really see any. And if your market prices are not incenting people to do things, I think that is a whole nother question. But anyway, so I have just a statement about that. Also, this whole discussion of talking about LRAs and QCs, day ahead prices, again, for variable resources, not applicable, because the LRA, the NQCs have been all over the place, but the must offer obligations are not based on NQC. They do not have any day ahead must offer obligations. They're trying to impose a day ahead structure on resources that don't have that as an obligation. Again, I just feel like you should not go this direction, but if you do, you really have to dig into the specifics on what is applicable to the resources that would now be subject to this that are not now subject to this. So again, we'll cover this in our comments, but the sweeping statements and the lack of the combination of sweeping statements and lack of details that are relevant to the particular things you're talking about, I think is very troubling here. So again, we'll talk about that in our comments. I do want to also just make a put in a general concern about the fact that the reason that the availability assessment hours were set up the way they were was to give people, to know for people at least an approximation of when things would be urgent, and to have that continued incentive to be available in hours when things were likely to be problematic. It doesn't mean that that was always 100% accurate, but I think there's at least some, if you're going to move to something, it is a much more short-term direction outside things like restricted maintenance hours. I think there is a question of whether that, if you give people very little notice, and I'm not sure I understood your slide there, but if you give people very little notice, there may not be much they can do in that very short term. Whereas longer term, if they know that there's certain times when they really need to be extra sure to be available, they can schedule things around that, and there are benefits to both and detriments to both approaches. But I do feel like a little more deeper look, rather than just assumptions about how things will work, would be a better approach. So that's just general input. Yeah, we'll get into more details on the comments.
Thank you for your comments, Susan. Next, we'll go to Nick Pappas. Go ahead, Nick.
Hey, thanks so much. Ansel, I was hoping we could talk through the tier 1 example just to sort of see if I'm understanding, and then I want to just link this to some of our broader RA policy. But was the example you shared from April, I'm assuming that's a real example, sort of in the vein of what we've been hearing about these sort of springtime, what I might call like pseudo reliability events showing up from the RA structure. Is that accurate? That this is like, is this a real April RA?
It is illustrative.
Illustrative. Okay.
Yes, I just picked a date that happened to be recent. So. Yes.
Oh, okay. Well, maybe in case I just go totally off the rails. I mean, I've been hearing a lot about
Okay.
sort of the springtime RA outlook being fairly poor, sort of as a function of kind of how we set our PRMs. Is that consistent with sort of what you guys have been hearing about? I'm trying to think of like when tier 1 might get triggered, and obviously it could get triggered during like a September heat event, but it could also be triggered in like March if we have a PRM problem or.
Yeah, I think generally, big picture, because we haven't determined the exact formula for tier 1, we don't have kind of an idea of when it would be implemented. I think we heard similar comments on spring and shoulder months on the supply cushion discussions in track 1 last year, but it's just an illustrative example. So go ahead, Dave.
Yeah, I do think maybe to your point, into Susan, I do think that in general, market participants have information to understand when these instances are more likely than not, based on weather forecasts, based on sort of what the time of year, just in general, the seasons, the time of year. We want to give people a heads up to say, hey, like when we actually see something coming based on our operational information, the actual outage rates that we're seeing, the load forecasts, how that compares to the shown RA quantities. To say like, hey, these are the more critical times. But we do think this is something where in general we expect participants to have reasonably good information about what the risk profiles look like, and that, to Ansel's earlier point, per good utility practice and the must offer obligations, we're expecting resources to, be available and to perform in all hours associated with what their obligations are as RA resources. But this is really providing that additional teeth to say these will be the consequences and incentives to be available during these more critical hours. So.
That's helpful, Partha. I guess I'll just say, I think we're going to talk about sort of the bigger picture, do we need it and how do we structure it, sort of policy philosophy later. But since we're here in this kind of design piece, you know, one reaction I have from the generator lens is, you know, linking this with the commission LRA, CPUC's LRA structure and some of the issues we've seen with kind of the inability to sort of get a perfected PRM structure that ensures sufficient RA from a kind of RA outlook in some of the shoulder months. I think one of the anxieties that I see from this is we're in a structure where both on one side, we have an insufficient PRM, so we aren't paying generators to be there for RA. And then the other generators that are in the market may face higher penalties because the sort of insufficient PRM in, let's say, a spring or fall month is creating, you know, sort of a pseudo reliability event. Again, you know, I understand Partha, I agree, like the details matter of how this gets designed, but if we sort of take the sort of RA outlook as a structure, you have both insufficient RA penalties on one side, and then for the generators that are in the RA program, escalated costs and penalties that are not actually tethered to any, I would maybe characterize, you know, physical reliability risk. They're just sort of a function of some issues, some artifacts we have in our PRM setting process and sort of how we design the program. So want to call that out. Not it's certainly something to consider in the design here, but I think just another reminder for all of us, and I think many folks on this call participate in the PRM process as well, that we really need to make sure the PRM is effectively set to avoid kind of downstream effects like this in the implementation process and sort of on the operational side.
Yeah. No, to your point, we're certainly hoping that this is a infrequently used process, you know, particularly tier 2, but also tier 1, that we recognize that there will be some extreme events, but those pieces being together and being together properly is important. We do think that within our role, this is a reasonable way that we can partner with the LRAs in terms of having operational tools and incentives for resources to perform that were shown as RA. But yeah, no, thank you for that. I think Paul.
Thanks, Partha.
No, thanks, Nick.
Thank you. And next, let's go to Paul Nelson, please.
Hi, this is Paul Nelson with the CPUC Energy Division. Can people hear me okay?
Yes.
So the slide says that the penalties would go to high performing generators, and it looks like that would apply for both the tier 1 and tier 2. I just want to confirm that.
Yes, I think that's correct. And there's a number of ways. We didn't have the details here in it. I think the idea would be there'd likely be a pro rata share between performing megawatts and load, and it'd be divided up between the two to where there would be some additional incentive for resources to perform, but also recognize the fact that load bears some of the consequences, particularly on EDM RSE failures, as well as some of those tighter market, some of the implications of the tighter market conditions for non-performance. And so that's how we were dividing it up.
Okay, so you answered my pending second question, was to clarify, and then the EDAM RSE failure, when that does occur, any penalties and that get flowed to load.
I think we're thinking about the same structure,
right?
For both tiers.
So my question is more of an EDAM question: is that when there is an RSE failure, any penalties associated with that failure, there's a charge that goes to load. I mean, separate from RAIN.
Correct. In the proposal, we're not proposing changing the existing RSE failure surcharge cost allocation.
Yeah, I just want to understand, because it seems like if there's penalties that are flowing through the RSE mechanism to load, then the RAIN penalties, I would think, should help cover that cost.
No, it's a fair feedback, Paul. And I think that was one of the options that we had explored, and we could still explore based on feedback, was to have the tier 2 be really designed around the EDAM failure charge, and to have to be thinking about like this is really sort of an offsetting, you know, the consequences and the charge would really be sort of tied together to where, you know, resources that are non-performing could be paid sort of their share of whatever those consequences look like, and that could help offset the load numbers. There's a number, as Ansel alluded to, the certainty aspect and the fact that those numbers could be very high was sort of one piece. We had a number of feedback on parties around sort of the implementation issues associated with that, but your points are still well taken, Paul. I think that's something we could certainly consider if there's an alternative design in terms of how we could structure the penalty level and or the allocation level for those tier 2 charges.
Now, yeah, now if the RAIN penalty, you know, is more enough to cover the RSC failure cost, then we can explore if there's, you know, revenue sharing between load and generators. But it seems that if the RAIN penalty should, the first allocation should be a refund to load to cover the RSC failure.
Yeah, appreciate that feedback, Paul.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Next in the queue, we have Adeline LaSource. Go ahead, Adeline.
Hey, hi, good morning. Adeline with Pacific Gas and Electric. So first, I want to congrats the team. I think you did a very great job putting this straw proposal together. It gives obviously a lot of discussion. I think it really addresses all the problem statements we have been discussing over the past 2 years. So great job in putting that together. Quick question. I have a question. So I have first the same question as Paul Nelson. It was a bit unclear to us in your proposal how the charges and payments will work with the 2 tiers. So I think I understand a bit better now. I was not so sure if you will have like a tier 1, which is like the new RAIM, will be working like as RAIM today, being self-funding. But yeah, for the EDAM, RSC surcharges, the tier 2, it was unclear if you will be mixing all together or so. That's potential details, but obviously there are obviously some details that we need to further clarify. But so I wanted to bring this point. And on the slide 17, where you have the example of the tier 1 assessment when you will be publishing the 8 days out look ahead. In the paper, I think I read that in case there is some tight condition, you will be flagging that there are potential RAIM days or RAIM exposure. But I think in the paper that if the situation changes, you will still keep this declaration and still keep potential RAIM day for that day, even if like so that's the thing. Correct. I was not understanding. Okay. So why are you considering that? Because I understand that tier 1, the trigger is potential scarcity event or like tight stress conditions.
Right.
Then if all SCs take actions and we go back to, okay, we don't fail, we are good. It was not necessarily clear why you will keep the RAIM right. Potential assessment R. So if you can explain that, it would be great. Thanks.
Yeah, appreciate the feedback, Adeline. I think we're open to feedback on this determination, but generally the idea is once the declaration is made, things can change between the study date and the trade date, but the goal is to have the incentive kind of continue to apply so that resources can are still incentivized to remain available. I do think there is, you know, some of those factors might be more or less relevant to that incentive structure, like the load forecast versus forced outage rates. But yeah.
And let me build on that. So like if we're looking at like the T-8 to T-2, I think there's probably a couple of rationales. One is if we identify at T-8, for example, to say, hey, based on our outage information and we're seeing load, we feel like we're at risk, that we're at least, it's tight and there's a reasonable probability that we could be in a condition where we don't have sufficient resources to pass the RSE into, so I think that we could say, okay, on Wednesday, we have additional information and we are, no longer at risk. Let's take it off. But in general, I think that once we identify as tight, these are to some degree probabilistic assessments. Like these are assessments that will have some amount of probabilistic. Probably wasn't the right term. There's an assessment that has a certain amount of variability to these, and there's a certain amount of error term to what this looks like. We're trying to be fairly conservative. But we view that like if we've identified at any point in the week that we might be at risk, we're not wanting to send a confusing message later, say no longer at risk, and then in a third day say we're back at risk. So by having it be a little more clear and delineated, we can provide certainty to participants to say yes, for this example, that Tuesday date, we view this as a risk date, do everything you can to be available and perform, and not have maybe that fluctuating signal of one day we see her in, one day we see her out, because this is to some degree an assessment that has some amount of uncertainty in terms of what the various changing components look like.
Yeah.
I think the final piece here is the penalty price, proposed as based on day ahead prices. So if conditions do improve, that would directionally mean that prices would reduce. That's, there's a lot of variables there, but that's another piece.
Yeah. Sounds good. Thanks. And I think we will talk more about the charges and later, like if we should have the two tiers being addressed together or not, but yeah, we have no time for that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. I would add too, and this is for all the stakeholders, I think that the tiered charges were probably the most, it was one of our harder topics in terms of like what those right levels look like, where there's like a theoretical right in terms of like, what do we view as like the value of resources during different time periods. But then there's sort of a number of concerns from like risk tolerance to what the impact might look like on contracting, various other parts in terms of like how this would interact with UCAP. So I think that's one where, we have a proposal out there where we're trying to strike a balance between various factors while providing a meaningful incentive to be available during critical periods. We do recognize that for each one of these could be higher, there's good justifications to have them be higher or lower or structured differently. And we look for stakeholder input on, did we strike the right balance, or is there a different way that you all would think about handling those penalty levels? Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Adeline. Next in the queue, we have Noah. Go ahead, Noah.
Hi, this is Noah Tom from Middle River Power. Just to join in on Adeline's discussion here. I mean, if the 7-day window or 8-day window to which you run the analysis and forecast for the first 5 days, it says, it's fine, everything's fine. But on the 6th day or whatever, as we get closer, it's now all of a sudden not fine. It seems like the forecast just gets worse, it doesn't get better. Right, and mainly because you want to prevent sort of this, potential of neurotic up and downs of telling people, oh, it's good, and then it's not good. But it's really no different than telling people, for 3 days straight that everything's fine until the very last day. It's not fine, guys.
Yeah, that's fair feedback. I think we can take that back. I think in general, we really hope the fact that like our T-8 outlook would be fairly conservative in the sense of that we would have information that would say, yeah, we're at risk. And you can imagine us calibrating it with error terms that look like it's super conservative, and that's sort of one option. We're really not wanting to run into that situation. We're certainly not wanting to run into a situation where we're suddenly at a tier 2, but tier 1 was not identified as sort of a risk in advance. I think that's like kind of a question of like, how do we calibrate it? How do we use information to make sure that we're having as forward of an information as possible with not having sort of overly conservative assumptions that trigger it in an even larger number of hours. So I think we're trying to strike that balance between the two. But yeah, I think to your point, it certainly would be suboptimal if 8 days out, 7 days out, we said no problem, and then 2 days out we said, yep, we're seeing a much different. And we'd hope that would be more of an issue of like if there's a significant increase in the number of outages, a significant increase in a significant change in terms of the load levels, those type would be outlier events would be really what would cause that situation to happen. But that's at least my reaction. Any pushback, Noah, or
Yeah.
you say it differently?
Yeah, no, I mean, I wonder whether or not you guys sort of inserted this particular position knowing that you will get pushback. And so my thought is if to the extent that a particular day is good and you're not going to go into tier 1, then any other day that was bad and is now good should also get equal treatment. So, okay, I have a few other questions. These new RAIN design or changes seems to be relevant to UCAP, right? Because what we currently have on RAIN is sort of a broad application of RAIN assessment hours for all mostly dispatchable resources. However, as we get into UCAP, UCAP has kind of taken that away, or is going to cover that because there will be, under the CPUC, it's a set of hours on a seasonal basis. For the CAISO's default counting rules, it's a different, sort of a slightly different set of hours on a monthly basis. So what happens if an LRA doesn't do UCAP? How is the treatment for RAIN that's applied here, equal for a generator that is, I guess, under CPUC rules versus a different LRA rules? Because it seems like those LRAs with a higher QC value and not taking UCAP is, has additional lack of incentive, or maybe more incentive, to have different outages.
Right. No, I think to your point, Noah, I think that's something that we really recognize within the design. And I think you could expand on that to different resources, to different resource types, to different LRA methodologies. And that I think we recognize within this construct, we don't really have a one size fits all in terms of what accreditation will look like for different resources and resource types. And we're trying to have a design that both works for different LRA programs, but also provides a reasonable incentive for resources to perform during these critical periods. And that it really, we're obviously partnering with LRAs on this, and we view the fact that the design is really based on the idea that LRAs will have effective QC methodologies and effective PRM setting processes, and that this is really built upon LRA programs that are designed to achieve objectives of having properly set QC methodologies and properly set program designs. And then this is sort of layered on top of a variety of different program designs. Like, to your point, could there be differences between them to where they are not really assessed exactly comparable from different LRAs? Yes, I think that is a possibility. do we think this is reasonable to work with different LRA program designs? I think the answer is also yes, that we're hoping it can work effectively for a variety of different resource types and LRA program models.
Thanks. I mean, then to which, how would you apply this to CPM capacity? You know, I think currently we all kind of view CPM QC values are based off of CPUC and QCs, right? But if we're actually looking at CPM, does the CAISO default rules apply here? Because CPM is not for one particular LRA.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know if we've thought about for all types of CPM and what the implications are. Let me think about that, Noah, and get back to you on that.
Noah, this is David. I mean, I think, you know, we have the existing rule about QCs that we default to the higher. If there's a conflicting QC value between LRAs, we default to the higher value. And I think we've seen that there's never been a case, I don't believe, where no LRA has actually, you know, calculated a QC for a given resource. You know, the idea that the default rules haven't explicitly been invoked, as I remember. So I think the same would flow through to CPM, that you know, the resources have it in QC regardless. So it would just, whatever it is, it is.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm trying to tease out whether or not maybe and by all means this may be a different slightly different discussion for maybe track 3B. But you know, if we look at sort of overall construct of the various LRA programs and how these things are going to be applied, I think it makes sense to look at purposes of various QC values and how we're actually applying and using, particularly for CPM purposes. Where does CPM come in and how? Because I don't think, you know, if we have two different sort of sets of QC evaluations, then you need to really make a judgment on whose rules apply here. And then finally, how do you judge?
Noah, can I ask a question there?
Yeah.
Is that a suggestion that part of this should be reconsidering the existing rule about defaulting to the higher value when there's a conflict?
Well, I think, I mean, you generally have the higher value in order to make your internal processes work, right?
Right. So that we're saying maybe that default wouldn't apply in the case of the CPM. That applies for the RA showings and whatnot, but CPM, you could potentially have a different approach.
If to the extent you're not CPMing for a singular LRA potentially.
Like collective deficiencies that
Something like that.
I'm wondering. Event.
Yeah, wondering.
Okay.
And then finally, how do you sort of measure success? You know, as you see the majority of resources potentially get under UCAP, and so you will have NQC values that drop, and the measurement of forced outage rates, you know, to which against those new QC values will make it sort of just lower on forced outage rates, I guess. How do you measure success of this new RAME? Something to think about.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Noah.
Thank you, Noah. Looks like we have a couple more hands here. We're going to take one more question and then take a break, and then we'll go to the remaining questions following our break. So next we'll go to Jasmine Guan.
Hi, this is Jasmine Guan with NextEra Energy. I just have a clarifying question on the process. So I was looking at the tier 1 timeline slide here. So is my understanding here that, like, well, for the 8-day look ahead, you're going to identify which days would be subject to the tier 1 penalty, and then as the RSD is cleared every day for EDAM, the tier 1 days can potentially jump up to like a tier 2 penalty for non-performing
Yes,
generators? Okay. And then
that's
would you
right.
be
And,
paying?
and the intention in the proposal, I think there's a sentence in there that indicates that they would not be overlapping. It would be, a resource would be subject to either tier 1 or tier 2.
Okay, so you're not paying both penalties.
Yes.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. And I do see we have a few more hands raised, but we're going to take a short 10-minute break. And once we return, we'll get to those remaining questions. Thank you. Hi, everyone. Welcome back from the break. Hope you had a nice break. We'll be getting started here again on next steps for bidding requirements. Before we go there, we have a couple hands raised from before the break, so we'll take those questions. First, we'll go to Todd Ryan.
Good morning, Todd Ryan with Pacific Gas and Electric. Yeah, I wanted to follow up on 2 items and make a few suggestions. The first one being on the conversation Paul Nelson and Adeline had earlier. I don't know if you guys considered, the fact that there's no way to guarantee that RAIN penalty or tier 1 penalties or tier 2 penalties will occur when we actually get like we may not the penalties may not occur when we actually fail, and then you could have situations where there's very few penalties where it fails, and so the possibility for funding an RSE failure, you could be widely overfunding or widely underfunding, and it seems like a balancing account might be appropriate where we could make sure that the RSE failures are funded by either those that don't show up because they didn't meet their obligation, or because um or if that's not the case and everyone showed up and uh we just didn't LSEs didn't bring enough, and then would default to load. So some kind of balancing account where at the end of the year or some period we allocate out any net revenues to um to well-performing generators, as opposed to kind of on a event by event basis.
Thanks for that feedback, Todd. Obviously, it was something that we had thought about in terms of like, is there a way to tie it back? I think to your point, the reason why we had the proposal where it was because it was really hard to strike that balance between it being high enough to ensure an incentive, but not be too high to where it was creating a significant risk, and based on the feedback. So yeah, love to hear if you have a proposal on how we could strike it better, or what type of mechanism it would be to better balance those challenges. Yeah, love to hear it. But yeah, thanks, Todd.
Yeah, we'll put more in our comments, but I think I agree with Paul's perspective that given that we never figured out how to truly fund the RSE failures in a way that is both allocated to generation and load, it may be appropriate to first or over some reasonable time period using a balancing account to make sure that any excess revenues can still be steered towards funding RSE, but then any additional surplus revenues can be allocated to generators. My second point was on the forecasting, and I don't know if you've given thought to kind of the on a day-by-day basis, so not in terms of timeline, but not in terms of like calendar timeline, but in terms of the look ahead horizon, whether you would, if a different level of forecasted deficiency might be used to trigger the penalty assessment. Like, are you gonna like, okay, we're forecasted to be 100 megawatts short on day 8. Do we treat that same 100 megawatt deficiency equally on day 2? Or we're 5 gigs short on day 8. Do we treat that 5 gig deficiency similarly on day 2? I'd imagine that your errors in your modeling reduce dramatically over that horizon.
Yeah, I think that's almost all like details that are like works in progress in terms of how the assessment would be calculated. I do think that you're right in terms of like what the uncertainty term from T-8 versus T-2 might look different. And so how the calibration and how that would go into the assessment might need to be factored in differently between the two. But I think that there's still sort of a work in progress in terms of how those tools and information would be developed.
Great. Yeah. So if and take that as a suggestion as well, that I think probably we need different thresholds for triggering the assessment hours based on the day in the forecast. Obviously, we don't want to leave it to the last minute, but I do think that different thresholds would be appropriate. Additionally, we might want to think about how that forecasted deficiency or surplus is shared. I can imagine different kind of, maybe you need different levels in between, hey, we're all good, and hey, we need to trigger the assessment hours. Maybe, I don't know if you feel like it would be appropriate to share the expected level of deficiency such that, on day 8, we're forecasting 500 megawatts deficiency. Those that are more risk averse might cancel an outage. Those that are less risk averse may not, and that's their choice. And as that, we get closer and closer, providing participants with that level of forecasted deficiency might help them decide, make better decisions in terms of canceling outages or not.
Thanks, Todd. Yeah, understanding that kind of what's the right threshold and how exact should it be, and then also based on how many days out it is, how to consider that sort of uncertainty band that increases. Appreciate those comments.
Yeah, and thank you all for the work. I really do think you pushed this whole conversation forward really meaningfully. So appreciate you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Todd. Next, we have Matt Barmark. Go ahead, Mark. Matt, sorry.
Hey, this is Matt Barmack from Constellation. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, thanks for the proposal. I just had a couple of mechanical questions about kind of tier 1, tier 2, and the relationship between them. I apologize if you already covered this, but it was kind of unclear to me from the written proposal. Does the tier 1 designation apply to entire days or just hours within a day?
So we did not specify that in the proposal. I think we talked about it as an event or as the whole day. So we'd be open to feedback.
Yeah, I think that both our initial thinking is it likely would be applied to a subset of the day. We didn't have because the assessment hasn't been fully developed out, I don't think we had an exact measurement in terms of like when it would apply, but I think that it's probably reasonable to assume that it wouldn't be a 24-hour assessment. Would it be would we have the specificity of here are the exact hours of it, or would we have a range? I think it's something that we're still in the process of developing what that assessment might look like. But
okay, and kind of related to that, I know you're proposing that once a day is designated, it's never undesignated, but could the hours within the day that are designated potentially change?
That's a good question. Yeah, we take that feedback. I don't think I have a good answer to that. My take would be we'd hope that if we had an hourly, we wouldn't be sort of switching it to say here we're going to roll back hours that were designated versus undesignated. But could there be additional one added? I think ideally we would have a process that had enough certainty to say no once we have a certain set of hours designated, we wouldn't alter those. But yeah, well, it's a fair piece of feedback, Matt, and we can take that back to the broader team to wrestle with.
Okay, and then sort of as we roll forward to day ahead, I guess, could there be some suppose it was a tier 1 day, but then there are RC failures. I know you said the penalties are not overlapping, but could there be sort of a mix of tier 1 and tier 2 hours or intervals on the same day?
I think that could be the case if we did indicate specific tier 1 hours in particular. I think last meeting when we talked about the EDM RSE failure approach, we did look at the specific failure hours during the day. So I think when you have that hourly offer granularity in the day ahead, that makes it easier to look at each given hour.
Okay, yeah, I appreciate the clarification. I'm just trying to figure out the proposal right now. So thank you.
Yep.
Thank you. And before we move on, looks like we have one more question from Mohan Nirula. Go ahead, Mohan.
Yeah, this is Mohan Nirula of CWR. I have a question on slide number 13. If you go back to 13.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah, so on the assessment frequency, maybe you don't have enough details, but here on the right side, it says per event, assess energy offers in each day ahead, hourly or real time. Day ahead or real time. So you're gonna charge for same hour in day ahead and real time? That's the question, because the current RAM construct, I think, is going to look at the higher unavailability amount day ahead market in real time. So if you charge for the both the day ahead and real time for the same hour, isn't it a double charge?
Yeah, no, I think you're getting it at we have that portion of looking at performance and real-time availability and performance as an added piece to it. So I think that when we're looking at potentially expanding this to having a real-time evaluation on this, I think we'd also have an assessment where we look at what the impact was to availability based on real-time bids or real-time performance. And so I think that component would be is a TBD. Ideally, it wouldn't be both. So obviously, if a generator indicated like, hey, I'm not available day ahead, but then also wasn't available in real time, I don't think we'd view it like a reasonable structure would say like, no, now you have two penalties. You have I wasn't available day ahead penalty and I wasn't available real time penalty. But I think that's a little bit TBD it's a layered approach. It might be that we would have a different assessment or have a similar assessment that would sort of look at, okay, you said you're available day ahead, but now weren't available or didn't perform in real time. We'd have an assessment, a per event assessment that would go along with that.
Okay, yeah, I think that needs to be worked on. And second question is on the exemptions. It seems like exemption is eliminated, but there is an alternative approach where that would be using a nature of work card. Is that the proposal? And I don't see a lot of details in the, yeah, okay.
Yeah, that's generally the direction of the proposal. We have more detail on, there's a table in the straw proposal that is sort of a first iteration of the proposal for specific resource types. So we welcome feedback on that and kind of in the spirit of on the few hours where RAM is assessed, managing exposure through outage cards.
Okay, so probably you may consider new cards, new nature of cards for this purpose, or you're going to use the same existing nature of work cards. So probably that needs to be looked at.
Yeah, thanks, Mohan.
Thank you.
Thank you. And we do need to be moving forward, but I do see we have another hand from Scott Olson. Scott, go ahead.
Thanks. Scott Olson with Avangrid. On the tier 2 assessment that if CAISO might fail the RSE, if CAISO has opted into assistance energy transfers, the AET program, and they're able to resolve that RSE deficiency due to AET sharing amongst regional entities, would the tier 2 not be imposed?
Can you describe the scenario one more time, Scott?
Yeah, the assistance energy transfer program, the AET program that BAs can opt into in the WEIM, that if CAISO has opted into that program, say for a certain time period, fails the RSC but has opted into AET, which allows it to now potentially share amongst other EIM BAs to resolve that deficiency or be sure that they have additional transfers in real time. Would that be taken into account when determining if a tier 2 situation will be triggered or not?
I don't want to get this wrong, and I know that if Danny Johnson wants to raise his hand, I think that we could love for him to weigh in. My understanding is that the AET is currently the real-time product only. Right now, but I don't know if Danny, if you want to weigh in here just in terms of the overlap with the EDAM assessment.
Yeah, if we could please unmute Danny Johnson. Looks like his hand is raised.
Yeah, as Partha said, AET is a real-time only sharing program where the WEIM can be leveraged to find additional megawatts through transfers at a surcharge. And it's pretty different than I think what the team is trying to frame by using the EDAM RFC failure as a measure of how well the forward capacity procurement worked. The EDAM itself will even try to resolve any shortfalls if a BAA is short through its processes, and then the AET is almost a secondary insurance policy if the EDAM's unable to. So it does exist, it's there for reliability, but it's not really related to kind of what I understand this proposal is trying to measure with the EDAM RSC.
Okay,
Hope that helps.
thank you. Yeah, just wanted to see if the regional market aspect, either EIM or EDAM, will be taken into account in this, or if you're solely just focusing on the CAISO BA. Sounds like you're solely focusing on the CAISO BA, but just wanted to clarify that. Thanks.
Yeah, that's my understanding as well.
Yeah, we're certainly focusing on the CAISO BA. There probably are nuanced questions here on timing. I think that when we're thinking about this, it is really associated with the CAISO BA, and when the CAISO BA fails the EDAM RSC. I think one of the questions that we have that would be in a subsequent initiative is some of the tools to correct. And there's been some question around like when and if we'd exercise those tools. And I think that we'd have to agree that we had new tools or products, we have to consider that, I think, in a subsequent initiative. But right now, I think the proposal is really just to focus on obviously just the CAISO BA, and when the CAISO BA failed the EDAM RSC test.
Thank you. And in the interest of time, we do need to be moving forward. So if there are any additional questions that we're not able to get to, feel free to reach out to us at isostakeholderaffairs@kaiso.com. So I'll turn it over for the next steps on bidding requirements.
Thank you, Christina. All right, so let's take some time to talk about this section of the paper on bidding requirements and must offer obligations for system RA capacity. So we had a few goals with this section, which was discussed to some extent in the previous stakeholder meeting as far as the interaction between the must offer obligation and changing QC methodologies at local regulatory authorities. So the goal that we have put out here is retaining what is the status quo today effectively, which is for must offer obligation for dispatchable RA resources. These resources should offer all available capacity that is contracted and shown as RA to the ISO. Under today's QC methodology, broadly, we see that reflecting something close to operational capacity or installed capacity. And so the goal here is to maintain that approach and set the must offer obligation accordingly to reflect that operational capacity. In other words, whatever capacity is available. And so we have another goal here, which is, given that local regulatory authorities are in charge of QC methodology, we want to coordinate with CPUC and other LRAs on this point and understand the impacts on the values that are sent to us by the LRAs as we develop our net qualifying capacity list. So we got some helpful stakeholder feedback from the the last discussions on the relationship between must offer obligation and qualifying capacity shown RA and the NQC value. So we heard from stakeholders on the idea of what would happen in the case of partially shown resources as well as partially deliverable resources, and how QC methodology set by UCAP is more of a statistical representation of a resource's expected availability, but Pmax is maybe not a perfect proxy for available installed capacity in terms of the must offer obligation. So let's go to the next slide. I think I mentioned this earlier. Stakeholders indicated generally that the must offer obligation should be tied to some kind of relationship to installed capacity and not necessarily Pmax. Today the must offer for dispatchable resources is set to shown RA capacity. And the goal, and stakeholders indicated the goal was to avoid requiring uncompensated offers beyond contracted capacity, but also recognizing that incremental amount between UCAP QC and Pmax. So when we thought about this relationship between these four values, we shared a formula in the SRA proposal to kind of reconcile these changing relationships in an era of future UCAP at the CPUC. So let's go to the next slide. So this formula that we're welcoming feedback on is, in order to set the must offer obligation, which is today based on shown RA, we would instead have sort of this adjustment factor that adjusts based on the ratio of a resource's Pmax to its NQC. So this is how we're thinking about accounting for partially shown and partially deliverable resources and their must offer. So next slide, we have a couple examples, illustrative examples to sort of demonstrate how this formula would work. I think we got some, again, there was confusion around our use of the term Pmax and requiring that to be the must offer obligation. So we're trying to clarify that here. So this example is showing 300 megawatt dispatchable RA resources. The first of which is shown and accredited at 100% of its Pmax, which is kind of how we think of most dispatchable resources today, if they're fully shown. Plant number 2 is the same resource that has been subject to a reduction of its QC under UCAP. And then plant 3 is a similar situation, but a resource that has been partially shown for some reason, whether that's it's been shown to multiple LSEs, some of which are in the CAISO balancing area, some of which aren't. So in the first case, when this ratio is applied, the resource still has a must offer that matches its shown RA. But for plant number 2, the shown RA is, of course, capped at its NQC value, which has been reduced due to UCAP counting. But when the ratio is applied, its must offer is higher than the shown RA and reflects the installed capacity or Pmax. And then finally, plant number 3, which is partially shown at half of its NQC, in this case 40 megawatts, it would have a relative reduction in its must offer to recognize that QC is not representative of available capacity, but the intention is not to require this plant to bid its entire installed capacity if it's only partially contracted to a CAISO VA load serving entity. So I think you'll notice there is no RAIN column. To avoid confusion, we had the discussion earlier about how resources would be evaluated for RAIN. This is an entirely different conversation that looks at the must offer obligation, which is a tariff compliance matter for RA capacity resources. So this is the summary of the concept that we have in the SRA proposal, and we welcome feedback.
Looks like we have a couple hands raised. First, we'll go to Todd Ryan.
Hi, this is Todd Ryan with Pacific Gas and Electric again. I want to say first and foremost, this is much more clear to me, so I appreciate you taking the time to further clarify it. I do think we have some concerns about maybe when the NQ. I think NQC, what you're talking about here, is could be more along the lines of the UCAP megawatt, and it's not unclear. It's not clear to me that the NQC value is always going to be equivalent to the UCAP when you have like partially deliverable resources. And so that denominator, when in this simplified example, when you're using something like a UCAP example, I feel like works perfectly, and I really appreciate it. So that was my first point. My second point is that we moved on from a very important conversation just a minute ago about the penalties and AET, and I think we need to come back to it for a second. And so I'm happy to hold it for future minutes, but we do need to have that conversation because I think what I heard reflected in the conversation was that the curing in the market penalty for EDAM and the curing through AET wouldn't be considered the penalties, but I do consider those the penalties, and maybe the only penalty that occurs for quote unquote failing an RSC, be it day ahead in real time. So we can discuss that further right now, or we can hold that for a minute, whenever you want.
Yeah, I think we can, let me touch on the first comment about partial deliverability. I think the choice of NQC in this ratio versus QC, I think you're highlighting a point here where for partial deliverability status, the NQC might be lower than the QC value. We propose this ratio partly because the NQC is sort of a value that the ISO has standardized for all RA resources and something that we produce each year for RA resources. But in the case you're describing, if we were to use a higher value for QC, it would change that adjustment of the must offer obligation relative to shown RA. So I think we welcome feedback on that because it is something
Yeah,
that
I think there's just a lot of
consider.
cases you got to work through where between, an ICAP based program, a UCAP based program, something that's
Yes.
partially fully deliverable. And I'm just not certain that this formula fully captures it. But all the edge cases, but I do think it's a major step forward. So I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Todd.
And on your AET, maybe we can circle back with that at the end. I want to make sure that to the degree that we're answering questions around that, I want to make sure that we have the right people on the call in terms of what the different tools are in EDAM and in the EIM market. So maybe we can circle back at the end, Todd, if you're amenable.
I will be waited with bated breath. Thank you, guys.
Yeah, good talk.
Thank you. Next in the queue, we have Susan Schneider. Go ahead, Susan.
Hi, Susan Schneider, Phoenix Consulting. Again, just not to sound like a broken record, but I assume, first of all, this is based on day-ahead bidding.
This is the must offer obligation for RA dispatchable resources in general. So some of those have a day ahead or real time must offer.
Okay, so this does not include variable resources, which do not have, they're not considered quote unquote dispatchable, and they don't have a day ahead must offer obligation.
That's in the spirit of where we're going with this. I think recognizing that generally variable resources already have a QC value from most LRAs that reflect kind of expected capacity and does not reflect installed capacity. So.
Okay, I'm not sure that makes any sense because the QC that is the must offer obligation right now is for all available capacity in the real-time market, not in the day ahead market. So it doesn't have anything to do with the QC. And the QCs have been all over the place. I mean, June QCs or July QCs have been 14% in some years and 70%, 69% in other years. But the must offer obligation has not changed, and it is not a day ahead must offer obligation. So I just want to be clear that this approach, I do not think is actually right for variable resources. And it's just and I'm not pointing it out just to be complaining again, but it's the other. It's another facet of the fact that these resources, variable resources, are presumably included or proposed to be included, but that you really haven't thought through the details. And all the examples here seem not to include that kind of detail as well.
And thanks, Susan. And maybe take a look at the paper. Love to get yours
I did.
written. I think the idea would be for VERS, to agree that we're having, like, if we're laying in, especially in the future, a real time and day ahead component, the idea would be that, the must offer obligation wouldn't necessarily change for any of these type of resources, but particularly if there are VERS that have, say, a forced outage, now there would be some sort of consequence based upon the shown RA value for those resources if they're actually on forced outage.
Well,
but otherwise it'd be sort of assessed a similar obligation to what's being assessed today, associated with what the obligations are to bid and schedule resources based upon that forecasted value. And so
yeah, but it's not based on.
It wouldn't have that same sort of tie into the QC. It would be tied into the obligation to bid and schedule based upon the forecast.
Right, which is not a day ahead obligation right now. And that is also for good reason.
Yeah, no. Appreciate that feedback, Susan.
Okay, all right, thanks.
Thanks, Susan. Next in the queue, we have Paul Nelson.
Hi, this is Paul Nelson with CPUC Energy Division. So net qualifying capacity, at least in today is how it's understood, is the net is a reduction that CAISO does due to deliverability. So the QC would be reduced if that amount's not deliverable. So in the context of that, I'm sort of struggling with Plant 2 that would seem to have a net qualifying capacity of 80, and why the must offer then would be potentially exceeding its deliverable status at 100.
Right. You're understanding correctly, Paul. I think the NQC is generally adjusting QC values lower, if at all, due to deliverability reductions. But the must offer obligation specifically indicates resource RA capacity should bid when they're physically available. It does not. So I think, but this is again, as I highlighted, sort of the deliverability consideration for partial deliverable resources, which is a small subset of resources, is something that we would be open to feedback on.
Paul, I guess there's a question here. It's that the column says NQC, but if it said QC instead of NQC, would the concern be different or the same?
I think it goes away if it's QC. But again, I also want to think of some of the comments that Ryan said. I haven't thought thoroughly on what Ryan mentioned earlier. I think the larger context is, the shown RA and the RA value and the must offer are intertwined. And I think a process where the LRA, is going to provide, shown values and must offer values to the CAISO, I think is the path forward. And that sort of retains the status quo, because today that's what the LRA is providing the CAISO is values that are used in shown RA, and also what happens with the must offer. So.
Understood, Paul.
Okay.
And we, just reflecting that we have received CPUC's comments, Energy Division, on this matter, kind of proposing to send a value through the showings process that's different from the QC in order to address this concern. So
Yeah.
just recognizing that.
Yeah, and just maybe to build off of Paul, I'd love to hear your feedback. To me, like the NQC reduction would reduce the amount that can actually be sort of reliably counted upon based upon transmission limitations on the grid. The question would be like, I would still think it'd be reasonable to say, hey, to agree that it's contracted and shown to us, do you want to have a must offer obligation that reflects the full value from a bidding and availability standpoint in the market? And love to hear your feedback if you think we got it wrong. Our own take was that like the obligation of the market should still be based upon that higher contract value. If there's some sort of limitation in terms of deliverability and or some sort of UCAP haircut, that might show up as a reduced QC or NQC value, but that the obligation should still remain at that higher level. But if you think we got that,
No, the thinking is, as we understand it, the way contracts are written is that, yeah, I mean, you're going to offer what's available for that unit should be offered to the market. And that UCAP, is a planning perspective for planning purposes. But, to the extent there's no problem with that unit, it should be putting in its, and let's just give it a simple example like plant 1, it's PMAX. Is the must offer.
Yeah, it sounds like we, from the previous or from the first slide in this section, that's a shared goal and sort of that effective status quo. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is the struggles that's going to happen is UCAP perspective. It works well for certain planning tools, like for resource adequacy that is done. But that value, an installed capacity value, I think works better with what you're going to do for a deliverability study. And so how do we reconcile the two in CAISO's processes?
That's a really good question. I know that's probably beyond the deliverability aspects of like how the study process works.
Yeah.
I don't think we have Catalin here today, but I think that's sort of a broader, there's some broader questions that we can.
A while back, and don't quote me on this, subject check, I searched for qualifying capacity in the CAISO tariff, and I think I found 160 something references. Now, I don't know if all those are the same, where if that means UCAP and installed capacity would be interchangeable for all 160 something references, but they may not be.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you, Paul.
Fair feedback.
Okay.
Appreciate it.
Next, we'll go to Perry Servedio. Go ahead, Perry.
Hey, this is Perry Servedio, California Energy Storage Alliance. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. I have a I guess, question or comment about plant 3 here. And I can't be the only one that's thinking this, but whenever I look at I think first off, what's missing is what's the contracted RA quantity. I know that we don't have visibility to that today on the CAISO side, but when I look at column 3 for plant 3 and I see a 40 megawatts shown RA, that might be the only amount that I've actually contracted. And what this formula does is it says that, yeah, you could have only contracted out 40, but you're still going to have to bid 50 into the CAISO. I'm wondering if you can help me understand if is that how we, is that an expected result here that I should be showing or bidding into CAISO at a value greater than my contracted quantity?
I think you're speaking to this sort of relationship between the planning value that Paul was discussing from the LRA side, the contracted value, which, like you mentioned, is not visible to the ISO, and then the shown value. And so this is sort of an attempt to allow for partial showing and like partially contracted resources, whatever the case may be, which then can be reflected in the shown RA. But then also to make sure that the resource, regardless of QC methodology, is still offering its available capacity in a reasonable manner. So, you know, the expectation would not be to have this plant 3 have a must offer of 100 megawatts. I think that could be seen as unreasonable. I think with the plant 3 example, partial contracting is one scenario. Another one is that we know that some resource owners show a reduced value to reflect sort of additional known limitations in their own resource capabilities, which might be a different consideration from contracting value. Like if there's a thermal resource that knows of kind of ambient D rates or other limitations, then it can reflect that in shown RA. I think, of course, UCAP might capture some of this, but it allows for a reasonable adjustment to the must offer to reflect those D rates.
Okay, well, I mean, I'll just have to say, if I haven't contracted more than 40 megawatts, I would either say it's unreasonable to expect me to bid in 50 megawatts. I could have sold the other 60 to another balancing authority area to meet their RA program rules. Or if this becomes the rule, what I think this does is, you know, I can know that this is the way you're going to do the calculation. When I contract out 40 to an LSE, maybe I'll say I'm contracting 50, but due to this reduction, you're only going to get 40 megawatts of value on your RA plan. That would work itself out either through the quantity I contract or the price that I contracted for an RA. I just want you to be aware that that's what the end result, you know, if you go forward with this and not consider that this contracting element of it, you're basically having that pricing impact on the RA, and the question would be if that's intended or not.
Yeah, I hear the scenario you're raising here, Perry, with the contract considerations, which it's a complicated connection here with different values, but
yeah, I'm not expecting, you know, an answer now. I'm raising it so that you all can think about. You clearly had another kind of example in your head when you did it, so
yep.
I'm giving you now another example to consider as you iterate on the proposal.
Perry,
the other point.
I have a question, is David. Why is the plant 2 and I'm seeing the plant 2 and plant 3 scenarios as basically similar in that regard, in that, you know, the MOO exceeds the shown RA value, and it seems like that's really.
Yep, I was getting to plant 2 in my next comment.
Okay, well then go ahead. Yeah, it just seemed like that's from your comment, that's the issue you would have more than the contracting versus shown. Like that seems like the bigger issue you sound like you're raising. But go ahead.
Yeah.
Maybe you're getting there.
Yeah, the other thing just to consider on plant 2, I guess you could say it's applicable to plant 3 also, is when the LRA when LSEs are showing RA to meet their planning reserve margin to say the local reliability or the local regulatory authority. What's really going on is those LSEs are showing enough capacity that accounts for any of the forced outage rates that could occur, and enough UCAP capacity to meet the PRM. So if you're asking for more than that, you're actually asking folks to procure more than the LRAs have said they should. I mean, put another way is, you will meet your reliability targets with just the UCAP values if the UCAP values are fully bidding in. You will have enough bids to meet your load, your 1 and 2 load forecast plus PRM. So why do we need more than the reliability target?
Thanks for raising that scenario, Harry. I think we're interested to hear from LRAs and suppliers on this specific issue. So thank you.
Yeah, again, I'm not expecting like an answer right now, but that's the, you know, there's those two issues of plant 2 and plant 3 when you get to this partial stuff that you guys have to consider.
Right. Thanks, Perry.
All right, thanks. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Next, we'll go to Kathleen Colbert.
Great. I want to make sure I'm not on double mute. Can you hear me? It's Kathleen from Vistra.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Thanks, Christina. I appreciate that. I think I'll just start with I want to support the comments that Paul Nelson made from the CPUC team. I think the way I heard him talk through and think through it is very consistent with the way that I think through it. I also want to provide you feedback that maybe I'll say I appreciate Perry bringing up some of the contracting examples. I did try to provide in my comments that I submitted last time those examples for you so you could understand better how commercial will actually respond. I do think that is an important element of a design around this. That's unique to California because we have our bilateral markets, right? My feedback for this for you and part of the Ansel team is what you have laid out here is not consistent with what's proposed of the CPUC right now. And I'm really hoping that we see a proposed decision this month. And then I'm hoping we see one in June that finalizes that decision. And I'm very hopeful and optimistic that once that decision is available, you will have more clarity around what is the QC for purposes of CAISO's net qualifying capacity process and the must offer obligation that's intended by the LRA. From a jurisdiction perspective, that is how we think of this problem, is that the CAISO's tariff allows LRAs to establish qualifying capacity. You then, of course, have your deliverability assessment on top of that to get to the net qualifying capacity. We respect your role here. I'm just asking you to respect the CPUC side of this equation as well. And what is currently in play and not decided is what that LRA qualifying capacity is or is not going to be for the CPUC jurisdictional area. Again, the timeline should be, we should see a proposed decision late May, I hope, and then June or early July with a final. But what is proposed in that docket right now is that the qualifying capacity, the LRA qualifying capacity for purposes of CAISO tariff is proposed as an installed capacity value. That installed capacity value is subject to the NQC process. So when Paul was asking this question about 80, plant 2 is 80 megawatts, is that the deliverability cuts? You can maybe better understand because the actual proposal being considered in the docket is an ICAP QC, which in your example here, let's say it's 100, subject to a net qualifying capacity process for deliverability cuts would get you to an ICAP NQC showing 80 megawatts actually means to us, to me, that there were 20 megawatts of deliverability cut because we've proposed ICAP QC be used by the CAISO as the LRA QC. And I don't want to debate what you've put out here. I just really do want a confirmation that you understand better what's proposed in the CPUC docket.
No, thanks, Kathleen. We certainly understand where the CPUC's docket's at. We're looking to have we'll look to have alignment between our processes and whatever they ultimately come out with. So that
is a very helpful. Thank you so much for saying that, Partha. Like, I am actually genuinely very, very nervous after this conversation and looking at this slide. Like, and I'm very nervous that you were not looking to conform to that LRA QC based on what you've discussed. So if you could put that in writing somewhere or just continue saying that you're going to wait until the CPUC decision before finalizing or formalizing, that would allay deep concerns that I have, and I would be very appreciative.
No, but appreciate that. We also recognize that, there's the CPUC, there's other LRAs. There might be a variety of ways to show this. I think the goal of this slide, at least at the highest level, was to get at the idea of, we recognize the fact that there might be various ways in which capacity is being derated, particularly to reflect historical outage rates within the calculation, and a desire by the parties to say, like, hey, to the degree that we are, from a planning standpoint, derating them, if we're going to be showing a lower value, we still view that the must-offer obligation we shouldn't be losing megawatts as a result of having a QC methodology that is derating based on historical outage rates. So I think this was trying to capture that different LRAs might have different approaches to that, but our goal is to provide the kind of an assurance to say, like, our must-offer obligations will still reflect that higher capacity value within the context of our program design. So,
Okay.
yeah,
Okay.
more to come.
No, I appreciate that. And I think the proposal, okay, so I do appreciate that. The proposal in the CPUC docket then is consistent with that principle, right? Because the proposal is that what is shown is your ICAP equivalent, and that you are going to have a must offer obligation consistent with your ICAP equivalent. So I think our principles are the same. If the CPUC does not adopt the comprehensive framework that's currently in play, I commit to helping you think through this. I have to be honest, this isn't the right form. So the way that you convert UCAP to ICAP is going to be the UCAP sold divided by your 1 minus E4D. So I commit to helping you if the proposal isn't adopted.
No, thanks, Kathleen. And by the way, I'll try to get through a few more comments, but we can hopefully go pretty quickly through them. We have a couple more sections that we're trying to get to, and we've, particularly with lunch, I'm wanting to end as close as possible to on time, but maybe we can try to go quickly through our, 2 or 3 more comments.
Next in the queue, we have Rahul.
Hi, this is Rahul Gavaskar with AES. Quick sound check, can you hear me?
You're coming through a little faintly. Can you get a little closer to your mic?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. I think I'll keep it short because Kathleen and others have covered most of the questions that I had. I would make a couple of recommendations. If in the table that you have on page 25, if you could start with QC and ICAP, right? Like start with ICAP, what's QC, what's NQC, and that will give a much clear picture of what would happen. Like I'm still thinking about the scenario, but is it possible that a 100 megawatt resource ends up having a must offer more than its Pmax? And I'm assuming in your case, you have the NQC that's 80 with a Pmax of 100 is being reduced for UCAP and not for deliverability, just as Kathleen mentioned. That's one recommendation. And second, if you could also align with what is the main incentive you're trying to drive at. I'm assuming the must offer obligation of 100 for a resource with 80 QC, is it still going to be assessed, the RAIN penalties or whatever is the new frame, it's going to be subject to penalties based on 100, not on 80. Can you at least clarify that right now?
So, good question, Rahul. I think for RAIN, the proposal in the previous section is for dispatchable resources generally, they would continue to be assessed based on shown RA. So if that were reduced by QC or QC methodology, then that would not be equivalent to Pmax.
So in this case, what is if my must offer obligation is 100 and I show up with 80, what is the impact? Like, why do I have shown RA is 80, assessed at 80? What does that 100 megawatt?
The must offer obligation is a CAISO tariff requirement for RA capacity resources to offer. So there isn't a specific incentive or penalty program, but it's a tariff compliance concern.
No, I understand that. I'm trying to figure I understand the incentive for me to show up at 100 is my future UCAP is driven by my force outage rate and so on. I'm trying to figure out what does it imply when my shown array is 80, but must offer obligation is 100. If I'm not being assessed penalty on 100, I'm being assessed at 80. What's the reason to have it? I could still offer it at 100. I'm just trying to figure out, what's the incentive? And I don't think if you don't have an answer now, that's fine. But those are the things I think we'll include in our comments.
And I think it's an important portion, and David's here to weigh in as well. I'll speak. To me, it's just really defining what the tariff obligation is, and that this really maybe tie in to like the discussion that we had during the last meeting, which is really like we had like 3 different values that we could assess RAIN based on. One was kind of the idea of like showing it based on the installed capacity. At the time we said PMAX, but really the idea was that highest value that could be sort of changed for partially shown resources. There's kind of the idea like we could just do it based on the shown value, or I think that what we kind of allude to is that we could have this performance benchmark. And the performance benchmark was kind of acknowledging the fact that for some resources, portions like the ambient portion and or like the non-linearity or the foldback area for storage resources that were discounted already in the QC value, that might not be fair to have a RAIN assessment shown upon. So I think for the proposal, what the idea was that we said like, because of the complications of including a performance benchmark, our proposal to start with was that maybe the shown RA value would be the right method that could accommodate different LRA and different designs. But we also kind of teed up the idea that like, if there were LRAs that said, hey, like if, said like, no, we really want to show you a lower value, but we think the right method to do it is to assess do an assessment based on a higher value, say like a performance benchmark or the MOO, we'd be amenable to that if we got feedback. But right now for our proposal, we're really saying like for the RAIN design, maybe it's sufficient as a starting point to have it be based upon just that shown RA value for simplicity's sake. But yeah, appreciate that feedback, Rahul.
Thank you.
Thank you. And we do need to be moving forward in the interest of time so that Ansel has time for slides, but we'll take one final question from Paul Nelson. If you could please keep it quick.
Yeah, this is Paul with the CPUC Energy Division. So on what Kathleen mentioned, there's various proposals being reviewed by the commission regarding the submission of, qualifying capacity. The schedule is going to be proposed decision should come out the last week of May, and it's targeting a July commission decision date. I wanted to follow up with what Perry, if I understood who he was saying, where the contract amount that would be paid and the obligation for the offer seemed to imply that we be based off of UCAP. I find that contract provision a bit alarming because in the reliability modeling, that unit is sometimes going to be available and sometimes not available in the reliability modeling. And that's what comes out is we're trying to achieve with, we're trying to tie the two together in the reliability modeling versus their unit specific performance. And I see problematics that if they're only obligated to offer a UCAP value when there's actually more available, I think is problematic because it delinks the process into the reliability modeling. I know this is off tangent of RAIN, but I thought it was an important issue to bring up. So.
Thank you for your comment. We'll move forward then. If anyone has any additional questions, feel free to email us or reflect your feedback in the comment template. Next, we'll touch on next steps for outage substitution enhancements.
Thanks, Christina. So for this section in the proposal, we have we reflected stakeholder feedback on the previous straw proposal from August on outage substitution enhancements. So we heard a number of helpful pieces of feedback on the proposal for the optimized, or I'm sorry, for the stakeholder scheduling coordinator substitute capacity pool. And we also, in that straw proposal, we covered several scenarios and proposals that we could consider, and we had one as a recommended approach, which was the stakeholder or scheduling coordinator substitute capacity pool, not the optimized approaches. So we heard from stakeholders that the proposed recommended approach did not meaningfully improve existing tools, but there was more detail that was raised and requested about that proposal from a number of stakeholders listed here. We got some helpful feedback on kind of the trade-offs that might be necessary between this kind of more optimized approach and how it would complement existing bilateral procurement processes. And then we had a number of stakeholders who did support moving forward with developing this kind of recommended approach, which was referred to as the shopping cart approach in the proposal from August. And these stakeholders raised areas where it would be a reasonable approach to take, and enhancements would sort of improve the substitute capacity procurement process in general. But we also had several other stakeholders who strongly supported the alternative, not recommended approaches by the ISO, and offered a number of specific proposals that we could consider. So the message we want to drive home here is we hear the different perspectives on kind of the merits and drawbacks of each approach, and we've been considering those. We can go to the next slide. So the idea with the recommended approach was to provide some kind of matching functionality through a shopping cart-like tool to improve that bilateral procurement. But we did have strong support for kind of more optimized approaches that may include settlement of these transactions by the ISO, and also potentially price formation through an auction process like the one the Department of Market Monitoring proposed. But at a high level, we want to see this proposal achieve the goals of overcoming the efficiency challenges that scheduling coordinators have for procurement, and also to the extent possible, prevent withholding of capacity, and instead have SCs offer that through this tool as much as possible. So on the next slide, just reflecting a few of the ISO's thoughts on the next steps. Our general direction in the proposal is to continue with developing the August recommended straw proposal approach. But we did hear some feedback on kind of considering a more granular product, which would allow for better sort of standardized product definition. I think reflecting that a daily product granularity for substitute capacity could be challenging, but I think a weekly product could be something we would consider that might offer merit in this approach. And we do want to recognize that the optimized solutions and the helpful stakeholder feedback on these, directionally, these could certainly provide reliability and efficiency improvements, particularly in the context of reforming the capacity procurement mechanism in future Track 3B discussions. This might be a helpful tool if we had more of an optimized approach based on an auction and a standardized product that would allow for more efficient procurement for backstop. So that would be something we want to discuss in future tracks. So generally, we're going to continue reviewing the feedback and developing the enhanced outage substitution tool. And let's go right into outage definitions. This will be straightforward from the March workshop. We have a similar proposal to what was included in that discussion to try to clarify some of the ISO's outage type definitions and introduce a new urgent outage type and remove the short notice opportunity outages type as well. So generally, the goal of this is to clarify the distinctions between different outage types. We've received a lot of feedback on that in the working group process, that the different definitions were potentially confusing or unclear. So let's go to the next slide. This is just a summary of what's in the proposal. The distinctions we want to make here are which, timelines of submission and the overlap between different outage types being submitted in certain time periods leading up to the RA month or the outage start date. We've really tried to clarify that as much as possible, but some of these different proposed types, the timeline is not the only distinction between them. So that's where we really want to clarify planned maintenance outages that are definitionally relevant to routine maintenance or new construction work. And then urgent and forced outages are not routine maintenance and reflect a need to remove a plant from service either instantly in the case of a forced outage or in the imminent weeks or days ahead in the case of an urgent outage. So we've tried to clarify that here. We haven't provided specific text definitions in the proposal, but we're trying to distinguish those different definitional distinctions and timing distinctions. I think one thing I want to reflect is today, a forced outage can be submitted for a plant up to 7 days in advance of the outage's start date. And then we also have in our business practice manuals certain requirements for notifying the grid operator in advance of those outages. And so we recognize the need to kind of clarify those notice timelines, whether it's a forced outage or an urgent outage, to make sure that the ISO grid operator has enough advance notice to take appropriate action. But we hope that this section clarifies some of the timing distinctions that were raised in the last stakeholder workshop. And we appreciate feedback on these new proposed definitions. Finally, with urgent outages being a new outage type, for RA resource purposes, it's clarified in the RAME section, but those would be subject to RAME. Urgent outages would be subject to RAME, similar to forced outages if they were not replaced. So I think with that, let's discuss next steps briefly, and then we can kind of wrap up the discussion and take any final comments.
Yeah, so for next steps, we have comments due Thursday, June 4th. And if you're interested in presenting at future stakeholder meetings, please contact us at isostakeholderaffairs@kaiso.com. That email is also included in the chat. And taking a look here at what's ahead, we're targeting summer for the revised straw proposal and late 2026 for the decision. And would you like to add anything there, Anthony?
Yeah, I think, thanks, Christina. This graphic reflects the current roadmap. So I just wanted to include that in there as kind of an anchor point, but we'll try to provide the latest updates on the schedule for this initiative as they develop. And then Todd from PG&E, I just wanted to follow up and say, on the assistance energy transfers matter, recognizing that it is important conversation to distinguish kind of how this proposal interacts with the EDAM and Energy Imbalance Market, RSE. So we would definitely encourage PG&E to submit comments on this or follow up with clarifying questions offline as necessary.
Looks like we do have a hand raised from Noah Tan. Go ahead, Noah.
Hi, this is Noah Tan from Middle. Just want to say, in the next iteration of your proposal, I think it'd be helpful, certainly as you said, to include more definitions for these new outage types, but also, it would be maybe my question is, do you expect to have the same set of natures of work in the sense that if I have something in urgent outage but it doesn't quite fit into that timeline. And I have to wait. Do I have to wait until a forced outage time window to submit it as a forced outage, even though they're both kind of categorically forced outages? Also, I think it's to mimic, I think the RC function and definitions process. So those timelines would be really helpful as you bring this into to the RA fleet here. I don't think we have had a lot of discussion about that. And then how does UCAP play into, you know, if I have a 40 megawatt outage that's on UCAP, but with a 50 megawatt must offer obligation, do I have to bring in 40 megawatts of UCAP substitution versus a 50 megawatt resource obligation? Does it have to, in the sense of, you know, does it have to be 1-for-1, or can it be one or better if the other resource has a better UCAP in that sense, which would create sort of a lower amount of must offer obligations. So there are plenty of questions, along with, you didn't cover, you know, the substitution. How does this help improve lowering substitutions or improving substitutions and lowering forced outage rates overall in the fleet? So really looking forward to more discussions to kind of have as you plan them. Thanks.
Thank you, Noah. Looks like we have one more hand, Kathleen. Go ahead, and then we'll wrap up the call.
Hi, thanks, Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. I was a little surprised with this section, it not summarizing stakeholder comments from the last meeting and kind of talking through that. The way that I received what you just presented is it felt like a recap of the last presentation. In reviewing the comments, I personally, because this is an important topic, pulled out things that I thought were worth discussing and kind of iterating and hearing more feedback and color. And then also, of course, hearing the CAISO's thinking in response to those comments. So I am disappointed that's not in the deck. I would very much so like to have that happen. Is that something you can commit to for the next call?
Maybe can I ask which comments in particular, which section are you referring to? That outage substitution?
I'm referring to, yeah, the last couple. So like if you go back a slide, I guess, a couple slides. Maybe one more slide. So you have two slides in this section. One is basically a reiteration of your proposal that you discussed last time. You refer to stakeholder feedback, but it does not include stakeholder feedback from the last call. And the stakeholder feedback from the last call, I thought was pretty helpful. I don't want to be pedantic, so I'm not going to iterate what I think was useful that someone might have wanted to respond to as an ISO, but I am going to instead just politely ask if on the next call, you could please summarize the comments from the last meeting, as well as this meeting, so that we can understand where there's maybe not alignment yet, and then we could make progress on that and hear your thinking on it. That would be a really appreciated process step.
Oh, thanks, Kathleen. Appreciate that.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kathleen. And we're over time here, so move to close out this call. And if there's any other questions we receive, feel free to email us at isostakeholderaffairs@kaiso.com, or also leave your feedback and questions in the comment template. Any final feedback from ISO staff before we close? All right. I just have a couple quick announcements before we close out. Here you can see some stakeholder meetings, comment deadlines that are occurring this week at the ISO. Here's some details on EDAM and parallel operations activities. And here's some details on market simulation meetings and business practice manual updates. And lastly, for insights into the ISO grid and market operations, be on the lookout for our Energy Matters blog, or you can subscribe. Here you can see our latest blog posts. So with that, we'd like to thank you so much for joining today's meeting. As a reminder, this meeting was recorded for informational and convenience purposes only. All meeting materials, including the slide deck and straw proposal, are available on the initiative webpage. The video recording and comment template will be posted there soon as well. So with that, we thank you very much. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
That concludes our conference. You may now disconnect.